Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Urban Fae Selkie Feud, Part 3, by Michael Lockhart. The shimmer of a large portal appeared in the near distance. The last. On the other side was Griffinholm, the place where my mom was born, and where her father was attached to the High Court. I had my doubts about my maternal grandparents. She served a war and death goddess, and he, an ancient and powerful set of beings that had affected the mythologies and traditions of most of the ancient old world cultures. I wonder whether I'd get to meet him. It would be the first time since the funeral, if it had been him at the service. Never knew with the Fae, of course. We couldn't just traipse through the portal with no problems. We'd made it a long way through dangerous territories, without incident, only to be assailed on the threshold of our destination. Snafu was all I could think. Out of the exquisite forest to our left, one that looked like it was made from scaled-up bonsai trees, what the Nipponese of Mundania call bonsai, and each piece of landscape was orchestrated to fit perfectly into the topography. It was like a small-scale diorama brought to the enormity of life on our scale. It was too exquisite not to contain bloodthirsty entities or be deadly in its own right. Surely the flowers at the base of the trees had to be poisonous or hallucinogenic. Still, the threat that emerged from the park-like open spaces between the boles appeared in startling juxtaposition to the surroundings. They were hideous. They were oddly quiet, no screams of rage. They simply shuffled forward, on long arms and short legs like arthropods, but with ridiculously long talons on every digit. They were completely hairless and a shade of sickly green, like dying vegetation. As they drew closer, we could see their great floppy ears and mouths so cramped with teeth and fangs that they could not close them properly. Small horns protruded from warty faces and shoulders. They were shambling nightmares, and though only about 4 feet tall, they numbered around 40, a large pack. Garin, while less taciturn than his cousin, rarely interjected himself into conversations between Sorsha and me. Without a word, he flicked the reins and hurried towards the patrol, while MB kept pace beside the chariot. He explained only after we were underway. Buto Ijo, deadly enemies. As with hood ratties, one had to understand the context. But when he did, much could be communicated with few words. In other worlds, many beings and creatures might hold an appearance that Sorsha or I, with our mundania bias, might consider aesthetically unpleasing, to put it mildly. Many were downright ugly or homely, and every state in between. That did not mean that they were hostile. Just like with people on Earth, Garin had just told us that the disposition of these creatures matched their appearance, that we were in great danger, and that we should all try to make it to the portal rather than stand and fight. The portal towards which we fled was large, and it had been in sight only briefly. It was further away than we'd hoped, and it was clear that as fast as our horses and wolves were, the Butu Iju would catch up to us before we reached it. I shouted to Garin so that everyone, including the wolves and Selkies, and all the horses would hear. Get as close to the portal as we can, but leave room to wheel and charge. Follow the chariot. I shouted the last even louder. It was the instruction to the group, and if the enemy overheard, perhaps they would think we were easy prey. fleeing only with fear in our hearts. I regretted that the bulk of our new recruits were bound to the Kier Mactir. I pulled a few javelins from the holster at my side, and when I saw that the loping monsters were in range, I patted Garen on the shoulder and we turned towards them. As soon as the center pole was straight after the turn, I leapt over Garen and ran out to balance between the horse team. I flung all 3 missiles in order. I had no idea whether the creatures charging us would be vulnerable, but we had to do something. The Red Seal clan folk were accustomed to harpoons, but the skills translated well enough, despite their not being as strong as cavalry. The motion of the small craft on waves and the undulating pace of a running mount clearly held some similarities, so they managed an effective charge. The wolves gaped in glee and outpaced the rest of us. This was a fight they understood. I was thrilled when each of my projectiles found and dropped, at least temporarily, 3 of the enemies. I didn't have time to pursue the extent of their injuries. I hadn't really practiced my next maneuver as much as I should before trying it in combat. But I felt that the ends justified the means and leapt backward over Garen's head in hopes of landing on the chariot platform. It was a straight jump, no fancy backflip, and still, I nearly overshot and had to grab at one of the sides that protected us from the wheels to maintain my balance. By then, the Buto Ijo were among our ranks. The chariot was the apex of our charge, and the 4 riders flanked us in a wedge with 2 on each side. Each of them carried 2 harpoons and a spear. Most of them found flesh, and more of the attackers fell. The wolves had engaged and now fought in a circle, back to back and surrounded by the slobbering, near-silent horde. The sounds were mostly from our side, other than grunts of pain or heavy breathing from the attackers. One would think with the pendulous ears the things would rely on sound. I thought perhaps they did, just not on those that they made themselves. Oh, my crazy mind in the midst of action. We did better than I thought we could. We had skewered, bit, and bowled over about 15 of their 40, though the wolves were now surrounded and fighting desperately. Garen needed no direction. He headed towards the wolf pack. We hadn't gone without damage. There were several wounds among our force. I naturally checked Sorsha first. She was fine, as was MB. One of the Selkies was holding an arm limply at his side and was pale and bleeding, yet still riding and clutching his spear, albeit weakly. We spurred forward, intent on rescuing our lupine friends, when I saw another group emerge from the portal. Fubar. I had no time to examine them. I cast my other 3 javelins, and we were out of missiles. Fortunately, the Butu Ichu had time to look. An eerie whistle arose from one of the larger specimens, at such a high pitch that it's barely registered. The wolves yipped and cringed momentarily at sounds that pierced their sensitive auditory systems. The monsters began to break off their attack and flee back towards the lovely forest. They dragged or carried their wounded with them, but left their dead. About 18 or so scattered on the field, mostly with javelins and harpoons rising from their bodies. Still bobbing merrily, the wolves were battered, yet only one was incapacitated. An older male who hobbled on 3 legs. His left foreleg was a shattered mess. Sorsha caught the bleeding Selkie warrior as he fell from his perch, despite the best efforts of his Fae steed. A female Selkie dismounted and assisted with the man. I had to register all of this in an instant so that we could prepare to face the next potential threat. Arrayed along the front of the portal were 13 beings. 12 goat beings, fawns I recall, goats from the waist down and sporting goat horns from the top of their heads, and 1 anthro, a strikingly handsome fellow with goat horns that protruded from curly locks to rise about his head, but otherwise quite human in form. He was somewhat hirsute, but it didn't hide the fact that he was starkly and impressively nude. A satyr. They watched us for a moment, and then, starting with the satyr, they began to applaud. They were clearly pleased with our performance. I'd been on the verge of losing control and leaping into the crowd of savage foes, and now I had to calm myself, to take deep breaths, to slow my heartbeat. I wanted to strike out at these interlopers. A soft hand covered my own, that was still perched on the protective sidewall. Sorcia's hand. The new arrivals were welcome enough, though I didn't like the naked dude who was staring hard at my lady. She couldn't help but see the third horn was prominent, but I had no need to worry. I knew her well enough by now to know that mere physical attractiveness and even impressive engorgement was not enough to entice her. I still didn't trust him or his intentions. After all, he'd watched those fell creatures swarm us and saw my companions suffer. Granted, the beasts had fled at the arrival of this new contingent. I noted that the fawns each carried bows, arrows, and an array of curvy blades, from a short sword to small carving knives. The big dude had a longbow cased beside some big arrows and wore a short blade slung from a baldric, one not unlike my own. He continued to smile. "You may pass. We just happen to be going the other way. You will want to get aid for your injured companions." He flicked a hand back at a pair of fawns, and they ran forward, each carrying a bag. "Perhaps our medics may be of service for the short term." Naturally, his voice was a light baritone that would have set most chicks' hearts to throbbing. He'd have made so much money as a rock star or a movie idol in Mundania. Never mind what kind of movies. He unnecessarily cleared his unstopped throat. "Well, while you are strangers about to enter our realm and should introduce yourself first, I understand that you may still be distressed from your recent experiences. You may call me Malion." He assumed an expectant look. I realized that it was not appropriate to be rude, even to the nude, and I had no cause. I just wish he had cast some glamour or even a plain rag over his junk. To make up for my breach of courtesy, I used the most polite Fae language of which I was capable. It made me feel like we were in some fancy novel. "I am the Mactir Dirg. My mother was of the Griffin clan. My lady Sorcia here is of the Goose clan, with blood ties to the Red Seal clan. The rest of our companions have joined us recently, but have already proven themselves worthy, and today have shown that they are indeed fierce and boon companions." He grinned. "Well met indeed. We were on our way to meet you at Wolf Hall, Dun Mactir, your grandfather's castle. We had heard that one of our clan kin had cause to face Serpente, and it seemed like it would be a good fight. We have our own argument with that one. Come, we will return through the portal and escort you properly to Griffin Hall. Once your companions have received further care, and your quarters have been prepared, perhaps we may discuss what our squad of stalwarts can contribute." With that, I was brought home to my mother's kin. Sorcia and I were the only ones invited to address the officials. Everybody else needed some degree of treatment, and they were certainly hungry and tired. So were we, but I had a feeling that we'd get some pretty good food, either just before or after we met the high echelon types. They treated us to a snack and some very nice wine, and provided a place to refresh ourselves. Despite all the ancient trappings and appearances in Otherworld, one must appreciate that the Fae are hardly primitive. Deeply ritualistic and hidebound by tradition, yes, but they knew how to build proper restroom facilities and employed climate control to indoor spaces. The facilities were places to clean and tend to the body and relax for a moment, or a day. In our case, it was a pretty short moment. We were expected and couldn't keep the chieftain of the hall waiting. We would not lay eyes on the king and queen any time soon. They dealt only with major matters, which we and our cause were not. The being we met was tall as the Mactir Moor, but not nearly so broad. Still, he was whipcord lean rather than cadaverously lean. Like all the true Fae, he was nicer looking than most mortals, with his golden hair and youthful features. His cloak sparkled with gold, and he wore delicate-looking golden armor to match the golden hilt of his long rapier. He sported golden rings on his arms, and a pair dangled from each of his ears. Even his high-rise sandals were golden. His expression was a little dour, and he looked down his nose like a stereotypical librarian, sans reading glasses, as though he did not want to be bothered with us. He probably didn't. He sat in a broad chair on a small dais that rested to one side of a much larger, grander one that looked like it should contain thrones, but there was no seating visible. Malion bowed at the waist and too gracefully swept over a hand to indicate Sorsha and me. "My lord, I am pleased to present Lady Sorsha of the Goose Clan, and her lord, the Mactir Dirg, Red Wolf of Wolf Hall, your daughter's son." I heard, and I did everything I could to stifle my reaction. The satyr had led us straight to my maternal grandfather. I realized he must have been glamored at the funeral. The build and hair were the same, but the maternal grandfather, I recalled, had looked elderly and his hair had been silver. This man, like the big bad wolf, appeared to be no more than 22 or 3. I bowed as to an equal. "Greetings, chieftain. We have traveled far to ask for aid in a grave matter. However, Lord Malion has informed us that he and his party were in the response, so we are now here to express gratitude and to greet our kinsman, as all folk should who draw near such a noble house." The tall man stared, clearly studying me, perhaps with a hint of a challenge. Fortunately, I had schooled myself to these games of silence that many old people like to play. They never expected my patience to be what it was. Eventually, he caved. It was his turn to talk anyway, in his case, with an added sneer. "Malion is no lord, only a shepherd of the wilderness. As for requesting aid, we barely know you as kin. My daughter, the Kokini Kiria, Red Grace, chose to assume duties away from her people, and then fled even those responsibilities. So what ties could her child, an orphaned creature of Mundania, claim in this realm?" This grandfather was clearly unfriendly. No ambiguity or testing for him to conduct. He wanted to be adversarial. "Snafu as usual," I announced to my mind, as if it hadn't already realized. Outwardly I smiled and again bowed. "I claim blood right through my mother. I am part of the Griffin clan and the Raven clan. My blood contains at least part of that which flows through your own veins. We did not come here as beggars, and I expect no aid. I meant only to pay respects to the royal family of my mother's clan. Instead, we are met by rude and ungentle words from my family member. I see now that it was by your hostility and ill will that I was abandoned to the mercies of Mundanian criminals, by you and my grandmother. I have completed my goal and offer gratitude for the assistance your healers have provided to my folk, and the substance you offered on our arrival. We will depart as soon as we can, gather them, and prepare our mounts." The sneer morphed into downright anger and antagonism, and his face purpled. But before he could speak, Malion interjected. "My Lord Chieftain of the Hall, I humbly offer one other reason to offer hospitality to this lordling of the Western Wolf clan. He and his lady and their folk destroyed a good half of the Butu Icho Gablin folk who plagued the western portal of late. Their folk took grievous wounds in the matter, and have earned at least some repose." Talboy's flush reaction from purple down to bright red. "Such as you do not determine what is proper and right reward. These did no more than defend themselves." He paused and clearly struggled to restrain his contempt and fury. His stare once again bore into my eyes, hatred blazing from within. "You may claim 3 nights and 3 days of guest rights. The sun is setting soon, and you have already used your first day. You will depart on the 3rd sunrise." He didn't give me time to respond. He just swirled away like so many other Fae had done, but with a golden smoke. Jakeleg must like urine hues, I thought, angrily. I would have been tempted to refuse, but I had to take care of my crew. "We call him Aprocheos Orana, the Golden Stream. He is free with his coin, and face it, with the cloak he looks like a walking stream of gold," Malion said, clearly in awe of my odious grandparent. I barked a little laugh, since the name fit so well with my internal summation that this grandparent was a puddle of piss. I had to explain the expression of humor. "Look, with all that gold, he looks like a stream of urine. Maybe the contents of a piss pot or spoiled beer. He was self-righteous and had no reason to treat me the way he did. He made his choice as an adult and left me when I was a boy, a toddler by Fae reckoning. He judged me unworthy without knowing me or anything I'd accomplished. On my own, with no support or even acknowledgement from him. If we didn't have wounded warriors, I'd leave now without a word. These people have forfeited my courtesy from me." That made 2 of 4 grandparents that I firmly did not like. I hoped my mother's mother would be more pleasant, though it was a cautious hope. The Raven clan was often related to death, though what mortals recorded about the Fae and what was could often be very different. So far, every tome I'd read had at least some relation to realities on the ground. Death did not seem to hold as much fear on this side of the multiverse. I'd also observed that although a being or beings were associated with something that might seem dark or negative, they often possessed qualities of light and positivity as well. The dichotomies rolled together rather than facing one another across a field of hostile intent. Sorsha placed her hand over mine with the usual effect. "Rob, I have to agree. I think there's likely more to why he reacted the way he did, but you've earned an explanation, no matter how powerful they are. The Griffin clan is not known for discourtesy. There is some deeper meaning to his behavior." Malion listened intently. I could tell he hadn't cared for my little diatribe, yet he'd paid careful attention. "Though we satyrs are held in high regard by most, it is not my place to speak of the motivations of lords and ladies of my neighbors. It is likely that you each have grievances." He rushed on before I could retort. "However, you were a child at your last meeting, and some explanations may have helped you at least comprehend his hostility, if not accept it as due. I know you only by reputation. and the few events I've observed, reputation is an important commodity, and yours has only germinated, not truly even sprouted. The being whom you mock has served in his current role for most of 6 centuries. In fact, he will have to move aside for another to serve soon. He will still have a position of honor, but immortals must occasionally change responsibilities or find life becomes dull. I nodded to show that I was not angry with him. I will understand if you choose to cancel your journey to join us. It would likely be awkward for you here to aggrieve a powerful entity within your home world. I didn't mean to put you at risk or offend you. It's a family matter and therefore creates high emotions. He grinned and shrugged. I would never go back on my determined goal so easily. Besides, someone will always be angry with me. I'm a satyr. It's our nature to be admired and reviled all at once. He held up a finger to make a further point. By the way, I'm not native to this realm, but to an adjacent one. Same world, though. I thanked him, and we made plans to depart the day after tomorrow. I held up a pair of bronze arm rings, and the 2 medics who had saved the lives of our folk. Should I give these out publicly, or... He looked at me surprised. Lords do not typically reward the common folk in this way. At least not in this world. I smiled. Fine, then I'll reward them at supper if you and your crew will join us. He screwed up his face for a moment, then decided that he understood what a crew was. Of course, my lord. Once he departed, I went to check on our wounded. The Selkie who had fought so hard was gravely wounded and had shifted in order to heal. There was a sea nearby and a protected cove, and we assured that the other 2 warriors, one of whom was his wife, had him in place before we climbed back up toward the castle of heavy spires. I'd given each of the 2 Selkie a silver ring and held up a gold one so that the wounded figure could see it. When you are well, and this will fit, we'll speak of your deeds in front of an audience. That seemed to cheer the poor creature some. A few pats from Sorsha did more for him. She knew the language. Griffin Hall arose near a craggy golden shore. I sensed a theme, as with the Red Seal clan territory. The singular color, with many hues, managed to be beautiful and hold some contrast and tinge. Yet there was a bleak feeling to it all, as though it was all of gold, but held little value. I didn't like feeling that way. My mother, who had been a merry soul, had grown up in this land. Something now cast a pall over the realm and folk. Sorsha placed her head on my shoulder. It's lovely, but there is a definite tension. Any thoughts on what might be the matter? I shrugged with my free shoulder. Frankly, I didn't really care. I hadn't expected any help from these people. Yet we'd obtained a satyr and a dozen fawns. As far as I was concerned, we'd come out ahead despite the injuries. We still needed to check on my wolf and the horses. And Garen, where had he gotten to, I wondered. I grumbled internally at how spread apart our forces had become. We'd found Garen with the horses. I should have known. They were each a little scratched and bruised. Some rubs and sweet treats helped assuage the hurt feelings, if not the bodies. The rapid healing of Otherworld had already begun with them. It had gone harder with my wolf guardian. He was already old, and now his forepaw had been amputated to save his life. He would have to ride in the chariot on the way back to Grandpa's castle. He looked up pleadingly, and while he could not speak, I understood what he wanted. He still wanted to find a way to help in battle. I assured him that we would find something both useful and honorable to accomplish. He gave a gape of appreciation, and the other 3 looked on what I could feel was approval. When Sorsha and I left, we were flanked by 2 wolf guardians. a matched male and female. Amelia and Hendrix, but with fangs and claws in lieu of hooves. All four had bad attitudes. We at last started back towards the main hall. It looked like supper would be sparsely attended, and there would be no full gathering until we prepared to leave. At the entrance to the hall, we started to turn towards our quarters, but a contingent of burly beings in heavy armor and carrying large spears approached us. When they clanged to a halt, I could see that they had the faces of lions and the manes to match on one. There was no overt menace. They were led by an officious anthro, who, while he looked youthful enough, he also looked frail, almost sickly, an unusual state for a true fae. Perhaps he was merely a long-lived nearing the end of his natural life. He was bald as an egg and dressed in a plain gold shift. He halted, his troops aligned 6 to either side, the squad leader to his right and just behind his shoulder, and gave an obsequious bow. "My lord and lady, please hasten or you will be late for your audience." Sorsha and I looked to one another, and then the messenger. Since this was one of my blood clans, it was my role, so I spoke. "With whom?" The little fellow looked nonplussed for a moment. Why, with the king and queen, of course." I looked at Sorsha again, and she smiled. "Of course. Let's go, my Lord Red Wolf." I managed to avoid rolling my eyes. "Lead on, friend. May our escorts accompany us, at least as far as the vestibule?" He nodded, once again sycophantic and fawning. "Assuredly. Your satyr companion already awaits you." We proceeded with as much dignity as we could manage and left the 2 wolves and Gairn to keep Malion company. He had no clue to offer when we met briefly. "I don't know, Lord Wolf, but this is a great honor, and I hope you will remember to treat it as such. The Griffins of Griffin Hall will not tolerate discourtesy." I patted his shoulder and grinned wolfishly to reassure him. Not sure it did, but after all, he was naked. He may not have needed reassurance. Sorsha and I, as ready as anyone could be, approached the great dais. There was no thrones. Griffins didn't need them. They sat on their haunches. I immediately recalled the first I had seen perched over Sorsha, warding her from harm, and keeping her imprisoned between its talons on behalf of my paternal grandmother. What a family. To make the scene complete, there was Grandmother Sophronia perched on the side opposite the small dais where Grandpa Piss Bucket sat, his features now carefully neutral. So I had both sides of my lineage present in the form of the 2 grandparents I knew for sure that I detested. When we arrived at the place designated by a circular pattern in the tile floor, I bowed and Sorsha curtsied, something I'd never observed her do. It was cute, and she looked sweet performing it. Oops, can't get distracted, even by her, I reminded myself. "My gracious king and queen, I am the Mactir Dirg, wolfling of Dun Mactir. At my side is my lady Sorsha, of the Goose Clan, and blood kin to the Red Seal Clan. It is an honor far above our station to be welcomed into your presence." I wasn't really sure we were welcome, the fact that we'd been summoned, but I chose the word to encourage felicitations. The 2 figures on the dais dwarfed the one that had guarded Sorsha, and he had been pretty large. The one on stage right spoke. "You are indeed welcome. You are of the Griffin clan on both sides of your family, even more Griffin than Wolf by that measure. Yet your father's kin shows most in your form and demeanor. Your manners are better than we expected from what you 2 represent grandparents, had warned us. I nod-bowed. There was no response required. He offered a compliment, and it was my duty to await his judgment on whether it was sincere or mocking. His speech worked similarly to Tom Tildrum's and the Guardian's. I physically heard it, but there was no way that beak constructed the words that reached my ears. He went on, "I understand that the man you know as your maternal grandfather gave you a rude welcome on our behalf." He cut his gleaming eyes at his chieftain of the hall. "It is his first failure in over a century to be cordial as required. Perhaps your paternal grandmother told him something unpleasant about you." He swiveled his head and intently glowered at Sophronia. She was quick, that one. "I did indeed, O king. As you know, I served the Morrigu herself, though I am of mostly griffin stock. I also share some kinship with the Northern Raven and Wolf clans. I told Lord Croesus that this youngling," she nodded towards me, "had talent, but that he had squandered it on criminal enterprises rather than finding a way to overcome the loss of his parents. In only a few years, he became adept at serving mortals of the lowest caliber. Until recently, he never tried to rise above that station. It is unclear whether the improvements on his behavior and attitude will take proper hold." The king and queen locked eyes for a moment. They were pretty clearly communing on some level. He turned back to Croesus. "Figures. I'd have a grandparent linked to another legend of the ancient world." I wondered whether he possessed the wealth of the mythological king. My luck, he offered no gold to assuage my hurt feelings. "Chieftain of the hall, what have you to say?" The old reprobate stood and bowed to his liege. "Great King Griffin, I humbly beg forgiveness. The disappointment I feel in my daughter's offspring was no excuse. I allow personal disgust for my descendant to cloud my judgment and alter my demeanor." So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.